Recording has started. I am Joshua Waits, the seminary archivist for the Virginia Theological Seminary, and the date is March 22nd, 2023 at 1:36 p.m. and I am here with Jeffri Harre for his interview for the LGBTQIA A+ oral history project. All right. So I just gave your name, but let us start. Will you please tell us your full name?
Jeffri Harre.
Would you please tell us your pronouns and how you identify?
He, him.
When and where were you born?
Was born January 12th, 1960 in Stamford, Connecticut, but I grew up in a little town called Darien, Connecticut.
And what brought you to Virginia Theological Seminary?
I came here to take a newly created position of guest house manager in May of 2012.
So you came as a member of staff before you were a student.
Correct.
And then once you were a member of staff, what program did you enroll in as a student?
I started off in the evening school, and then the dean made a comment in the class that I took about, he called all the non-degree students, or the evening program and non-degree students down and said, here's what you need to do. You might also want to think about transferring this class for credit to like an MDiv. I was like, no. I'd already, told my diocese that I was not interested in being in the process any longer. So I was not looking to be ordained. So I got an MA. So I completed it in 2019.
And the dean at the time was?
Ian Markham.
So the current dean and president. And you were taking his
systematics.
And was this being offered through lifelong learning?
Well, yeah, there was one of the classes that, they had their own program. So that was the evening school, you got a certificate, which they no longer have that program. And when I started taking the classes, which we could just take, we didn't have to get credit for it or anything. I figured I'm doing the work, I'm going to get the piece of paper, even if it's just a certificate. But after the dean made a suggestion, I hadn't been hot about which degree, and one of the then students said, well, if you don't want to be ordained, you don't have to get an MD. If you could get an MA, and I kind of went.
So you talked about that you had already talked to your diocese that you didn't want to be in the process for ordination anymore. That's why you chose not to do the MDiv and chose to go with the MA. Would you mind giving us sort of a synopsis of your history before VTS in relations to whatever you feel comfortable showing, but like your family, career, and of course your process of coming out and identifying and those things?
Well, so in terms of the church, my parents belonged to the Episcopal Church. My mother's family had been Episcopalians for a fair while. My great uncle was an Episcopal priest, but they left the church about the time we moved to Darien. So when I was 3, there were some issues around some Black families that had moved into the neighborhood, and the church got very divided over whether or not they should be admitted for membership. And my parents were like, this is not a question. They should be members. If you're going to be this way, we're leaving. So my brother and I grew up unchurched. I did not come back to the Episcopal Church until I was in my late 20s. I had been a member of the UCC for since college, but came back to the Episcopal Church in my late 20s. And then I was a longstanding member of Integrity. I belonged to Integrity White Plains, which was a non-chapter because it crossed diocesan lines. So some of us were in Connecticut, some of us were in New York. It's just because White Plains was much closer than Hartford. There was also an Integrity chapter in Hartford, which I did attend some of those meetings. And I remember, well, I started discerning call when I was a member of the UCC, and I got the whole, we used to go and have some life, this was in my very early 20s, go get some life experience and come back when you're older. And so I did not approach my parish priest until the early 90s and started the process. I went through four bishops, God knows how many canons of the ordinary, several different revisions of the process in the Diocese of Connecticut. And so the first round, I actually interviewed with Bishop Coleridge, who was not, which is really weird because when he was Bishop Suffragan, he was sort of the go-to person for the LGBTQ clergy in the diocese, where that was sort of the impression. They felt comfortable with him. But once he became diocesan, he sort of flipped on the issue. And so we had to so the discernment committee passed me on, and I had an appointment to go. Well, no, even before we submitted the paperwork, my rector got in touch with the head of the Commission on Ministry. At that time was Ellen Tillotson, who's now on our board because she was on the general board. And she was, because he didn't want to deal, the bishop didn't want to deal with gay candidates. And as diocesan bishop, he was on the mailing list to get the newsletter for the integrity chapter, which I edited the newsletter. And Ellen said to Ledley, if he has the newsletter here and your process file comes across the desk, he will intentionally not connect the two. The first interview I had with was with the bishop and the new Bishop Suffragan, the canon of the ordinary, and we got back a letter that Ledley and I fondly referred to as the "Get Thee to a Nunnery" letter, because they recommended that I go to one of the monastic communities and consider becoming an oblate and just kind of doing some more discerning, and like I'm not going into it, which I did. I mean, they tell you to do something, you do it, and I went to Holy Cross on the Hudson River, and so that went on a while. I eventually because the first discernment committee got very confused and wasn't, so we did a second discernment committee, because Ledley and I realized that almost everybody on the first committee was either the child of a priest or married to a priest or somehow related to a priest. So it's like the second time we decided we weren't doing that. And so did it again. That's what got me to the interview. And I sort of let that sit for a while after having done what I needed to do. And I'm like, okay, I need to think about it. So started talking, anytime we got a new rector, he more or less dead-ended my process. At one point he looked at me and said, I'm really concerned about that your spiritual director is not doing the typical model of spiritual direction, because she had me, part of my work with her was also part of my discernment. So she said, no, go visit this church, go visit this church in this other denomination, see if you really want to be, are you not called to be a deacon? Which was definitely not. And it was like, no, this is very clear. But I what I should have done, looked at him and said, you're not doing the traditional model of discernment for the priesthood with your parishioners. So, but he essentially dead-ended the process. I ended up leaving the parish. I think he's still convinced it was because he dead-ended the right process. No, it was because I even though I was the chair of the committee that called him to be rector, it just wasn't. He pushed the parish's buttons, the parish pushed his buttons. It just was, so I finally had enough and left. So I let that sit. And then a friend of mine who had been the chair of my second discernment committee also went into discernment. My mother was the chair of his discernment committee. And he went through, and I went to his ordination. I mean, Rob was a good friend and had been. And my mother was always like, I just don't see Rob as a priest. He's not very pastoral. And I said, Mom, I got more pastoral care from Rob, who was still in discernment at that point, than I did from Bill, our priest. It was like, I said, I can see Rob doing this. Rob is now the dean of the cathedral in Baltimore. So I went to his ordination, and I was going to the church in Fairfield. It was embarrassing. I can't remember the name right off the top of my head. Anyway, the way the church is designed, there's a center aisle, and then the pews go right to the walls. So you can only go down and come back at communion. So I went up for communion, and there were people from St. Paul's in Fairfield, from both Grace and St. Paul's, because Rob had done his field work at St. Paul's. And we had 2 people being ordained. And so I went up for communion. I happened to be on the side of the church where Rob was serving communion. And he's coming down. And by the time he comes to me, my eyes teared up. It was like, and then the other priest of the parish was doing the chalice, and she sort of laid her hands on mine. But then I had to get up and turn around and face the entire congregation. Fortunately, only 2 people really noticed. So it was, yeah. So I went back to I'd also talked to the priest at St. Paul's. I talked to Ben a few times about that. He didn't see a call. I'm like, okay, fine. Bill finally left Grace. I went back to Grace. I liked the priest that they called the priest in charge. I liked her very much. But after I'd been back a few months, I went and talked to her. She's like, sure, another discernment committee. You know, she handed me the paperwork from the discernment committee in the vestry on my 50th birthday. And it kind of sat there. I was cleaning off my desk about 18 months later, shortly before I came here. And well, even before I knew that this job was going to be a thing. And saw the folder and went, well, that's a message. And so just said, no, I'm not going to do this. And then like 18 months later, here I was working here. So God has a sense of humor.
So you felt this sense of call. And there seemed to be roadblocks all along the way of the discernment process. And eventually that led to you coming to VTS. When it comes to those roadblocks, do you think that those roadblocks were there due to your sexuality, or do you think it was more due to like processes, or how did you interpret those roadblocks?
With Bishop Coleridge, there was a perceived roadblock because there were certain things we just didn't tell the bishop. We didn't tell him. I think part of the problem with the interview was they saw it was somebody that was still living with his mother, and it wasn't still, it was, I had been in a long-term relationship, it had ended. I really had no place, hadn't planned on where I was going, and my mother had reached a point, it was after my father died, and she wasn't comfortable. She decided she wasn't comfortable living alone, so it just made sense. It wasn't like I hadn't left, hadn't ended an independent life, but we couldn't tell Bishop Coleridge that I just come out of this 10+ year relationship with another man.
So even though you were part of integrity, and even though there were people that were appointed to assist and minister to the LGBT plus clergy, even though it wasn't
Yeah,
necessarily
not so
official.
much under Bishop Coleridge, but yes.
It was still one of these things, if you want to, in your experience, you don't say it if you want.
Keep it under the radar.
Um,
It's still,
yeah, and this is in the 90s.
yes.
And so then, of course, before you come to VTS, we have, remind me of the year you came to VTS was
I started here May 1st of 2012.
2012. So by this point in time, June Robinson has already happened.
I was at that general convention.
Would you like to tell us about?
Well, so at that point, I was working at the church center. I started working at the church center in 2002.
Mhm.
And that was 2003. So that would have been Minneapolis. And I had been part of setting up the children's program, but because I was sort of the administrative person in the department, the office felt no reason for me to go. And the group of people, was I think that was then the National Organization of Episcopal Resource Centers. And so they pulled a bunch of money, paid for my flight, found me a place to stay. So I was there, but so I saw the protesters. I was there when the whole incident about the website that came up, and that really wasn't an issue because it was like, it was a link off of somebody else's website who had linked to, it was just bad. But I remember there was a lot of tension around that general convention.
And so by the time you get to VTS, that had occurred and the Episcopal Church was sort of in the middle of the ACMA split.
Yes.
And then you come to VTS, who's still having to deal with some of those ramifications. And part of that, at the time, VTS in the 90s had changed its policy to allow openly queer people to come in for the MDiv program.
As long as they were single.
As long as they were single. But by the time you were here, Dean Markham was practicing and sort of encouraging what was called the generous orthodoxy.
Well, he may have called it that.
So what was your experience of VTS at that time when it's trying to figure out how do you?
Well, so because of my job, I lived on campus. So I lived, and I had part of my package was, as long as the refectory is open, I got to have breakfast and dinner, not just lunch like most staff people. So I literally was living amongst the students, and then after 3 years, I became a student. So I was not only living with them, I'm taking classes with them. So there definitely were not as many openly gay students when I got here. There were 3 faculty members that I knew of. So, and it's not telling you, so one, Luthana Hook, Lisa Kimball, and Bill Roberts, who is the now retired professor of music. But students, there were some, but they not as open and definitely not as vocal. The first couple of years I was here, there was this sort of group that existed that became Prism, and I haven't seen they've done anything this academic year, but so
I think they had like one.
Yeah.
The beginning, but that's the only time I've seen it.
So yeah, we knew we were here. People knew who some of them were. People in general, some other they didn't know in general. there was this sort of kind of a weird moment where this a junior arrived on campus with a girlfriend and then came back from Thanksgiving break with a boyfriend. Like somebody came to me, you were right. I said, what was I right about? He's gay. And I went, occasionally my gaydar is right, not always.
What was it like being an openly gay person on staff? Was there tension or was it?
Not really. Which is also surprising because at one point, well, maybe not, but so I went through, because the department that I worked in went through several iterations and they were shuffling some of the senior staff around. I originally started working for Katie Glover, and they switched her position around, and I ended up working for Linda Huntington because they took the HR piece of what Linda was doing and gave it to Katie. Linda was part of her husband is an alum, and she belongs to a very conservative congregation, but that was never an issue when I worked for her. In fact, she's still a friend. I think for the most part, it just wasn't talked about. I mean, I had Lisa to talk to. I didn't know Ruthann. I knew Lisa before I got back. Lisa's part of the reason I moved here. So I knew I could talk to Lisa. I didn't know Ruthann. I didn't know Bill. Ruthann. I worked for Ruthann before I got the church center. I didn't know about Joe for a good while. So, but in terms of staff, there wasn't anybody else when I first got here that I know of on staff, I don't think. And then we had, now on staff, I think there's only 2 of us, possibly. I mean, there's faculty, but I mean, it's staff itself.
On staff?
I'm trying to think.
No, there's more.
Oh, wait a minute, your staff.
Yeah, there's 3 in the library staff alone.
Okay. Oh, you're right. One of those.
So I think we're at 5.
Okay.
Yes. So
I won't press because I don't know who the third person is. I may know, but I.
So with you've already sort of been describing your involvement with the larger seminary queer community. What has been your sort of your involvement and current relationship with the community, particularly you mentioned prison?
Well, if there were, because prison was theoretically open to students and staff and faculty, when there were meetings that I could get to, I went to, but I don't know whether I got told about the first meeting this year. But usually went to the coming out day event that they had. We very rarely, except for prison stuff, we very rarely socialized as like a group of gay students. Let's okay, you know, there wasn't that kind of, we knew who was here for the most part. There were individual conversations, but we didn't really socialize. I mean, some of them are older than I am, so it wasn't necessarily an age issue.
Do you think that was beneficial or
in terms of
the not having to necessarily, what do you think so I'm trying to get at is, let me think, why do you think that's the case, that there wasn't necessarily this, let's form a clear community that's very tight-knit? And
well, I think part of it is this is a small campus, and so there were those folks that definitely were not out and didn't want to be seen as being out. There were those folks that came from difficult dioceses and so needed to be rather careful about what they were doing and who they were hanging out with, which was why the student group would often have, we'd often have closed meetings. You know, so that just sort of the LGBTQ people meet and not anybody else.
And Prism still does, when it meets, it's still often closed meetings.
Sometimes.
In your estimation, is that still necessarily the case that there are students that fear biases from their diocese?
Know there are students here from some of those dioceses. I know there have been students who switched dioceses because of the issues in the diocese. Some before they got here, some while they were here. But it's really hard to tell sometimes how much of an issue it is. Because the seminary focuses on other diversity issues and inclusion and everything else, it's sometimes feels like it's a second thought by the time they think, oh yeah, them too.
Yeah. Even though we have the seminary covenant that makes mention of it.
So we have a covenant. It came out right before commencement, the year I graduated. And on the website, it still says there will be an expanded version coming later that's got all this other stuff in it. I've never seen it. I've never seen it. Then they were going to do that. There's no link to it. It's just says we're going to do this. And that's now 4 years, almost 4 years ago.
Do you think that the idea of developing the covenant or and posting it, that has it had any effect on the inclusion of queer people at VTS?
I don't think so. I think the seminary has become, and there are issues, there have been issues, there are ongoing issues, but I think the whole inclusion and cultural competency and all that stuff is primarily focused on people of color, and even more so African American students. And there have been some major issues in the time I've been here with that. But as far as the LGBTQIA folks,
So it's just, in your estimation, it's not, it's secondary, tertiary to dealing with the larger or the perceived larger issue of people of color, diversity and inclusion. So how has your relationship with the LGBTQIA community at VTS changed in the 13 years that you've been here?
I've been here 13,
Sorry,
12.
11, forgive me.
That's okay.
I'm a historian, we don't do
Yeah.
math.
Sometimes you got it.
Timeline, that's all I need is dates. So in the 11 years that you've been here,
Right.
how has your relationship with sort of this sometimes queer community been
Well,
changed?
so I no longer live on campus. I moved off 18 months ago because my job changed, which in many ways is a good thing. Not living on campus, but I do not have as much contact as I used to. So
Um, when when you were living on campus and now that you're off campus, both as a staff person and as a student, who would be the particular people that you would say, or organizations or programs that you would say were particularly like allies that you could turn to, um, or if that wasn't the case for you?
Um, m- Mostly, it would be um, Lisa for a good chunk, and a couple of other students that I got to be friends with and I'm still friends with, but they would be that I could talk to her. But mostly, I was the supportive space.
So and did you find that sort of thrust upon you, or did you fall into that sort of space as the supportive role?
It just sort of fell on me. And it wasn't necessarily just the LGBTQIA students, it was also other students, but I mean, I got a note from one student who said, "You are the most pastoral presence on this campus." And I was kind of like, really? We've got a problem if that's the case. But yeah, I mean, I think it's part of that comes from being a spiritual director. But I wasn't trained at that point. I wasn't doing spiritual direction for other people at that point, but yeah, people would come and talk to me.
And so this, was there anything that you would feel comfortable sharing that, um, any like key moments where you were acting as that support and sort of spiritual guide that stand out, uh, in concerns to, uh, people's sexuality and gender identity?
Yeah, it's not something I can.
It's nothing
Really?
you can reveal.
Yeah.
So we've talked about, sort of the priorities of inclusion. Would you consider VTS to be an inclusive community at this time?
It's trying.
Okay.
I think it's definitely more inclusive than it was. Sometimes I feel like it doesn't know how to deal with as many queer folks as it has. It's, one year we had an incoming class and all the single men were gay, except for maybe two.
That was my class.
So, I mean, yeah, and also many more men than transgender folks or lesbian folks, although we have comparatively a lot more transgender folks than we did.
So you say VTS is trying, but is sort of struggling to sort of keep up with the numbers, as it were. Is that what is your estimation of why that is the case? Is that like, is it theological? Is it policy? Is it actual discrimination? Lack of resources? What do you sense is the case?
In general, we're not a squeaky wheel. Around here, the squeaky wheel gets the attention.
Why do you think, the community is in a squeaky wheel?
Well, as far as I know, so far in the time I've been here, there have not been any really major issues dealing with the queer community here, at least not anything that anybody felt that the seminary needed to know.
Well, you mentioned earlier, that the seminary had changed its policy that if you were a single student and were open, you could attend and earn your MDiv. And you were here, you've been here, so you were here in 2015 when the SCOTUS ruling on marriage came down. And of course, you were also here in 2018 when the General Convention affirmed marriage throughout the entirety of the church. And of course, when the compromise with bishops and those things. When the marriage ruling came down, was there any effect on campus or?
So there had been, for a while, there'd been an understanding because of mostly having to do with states and some dioceses, that if you were LGBTQ and unmarried to a partner of the same gender, that you were that they would admit you and also put you in family housing. Once it passed General Convention, then everybody had the same standards. There were a couple of exceptions made for people that were from dioceses that were still problematic and are still problematic. But yeah, so pretty much everybody's now on a sort of a level playing field in terms of housing.
So the rule was before, correct me if I'm wrong, the rule before marriage equality, the marriage equality ruling, was if you were openly gay and partnered, but of course not able to be legally married, you could openly live on campus, in campus housing with your partner. Is that correct?
Yeah, and before the apartments were built, there were arrangements made with a couple of the local apartment complexes. So,
and then after the ruling, that changed, and so no longer you would be required to be married to qualify for student housing.
of course, there have been exceptions.
There's exceptions to the rule. And did that happen after the ruling or after General Convention?
I think it happened after General Convention, but it may have, parts of it may have started between the ruling and General Convention. That's seems to, of course, we all know how memory plays
Right.
tricks, but it seems to me like they were heading in that process sort of in between the SCOTUS ruling and the General Convention resolution.
That's a very interesting, like, depending on how you would want to interpret that, you could actually say that the government, the DTS was more open and accepting before the ruling. Or in your estimation, why do you think that ruling, that policy was put in place once the ruling was made?
Well, because if you could legally get married, and that's why my memory seems to think, because states were passing that, even if, and some dioceses were okay, but once the states were starting to pass stuff, then if you have the opportunity to be married, then you need to be married. That's part of church says it is.
So there was this idea of, well, now that you can, you should conform.
Pretty much. And since then, we've had some one instance recently where there was a non-traditional family. And one of the students was part of the queer community, and the other was straight, but they've been a family unit forever, and weren't married, and so they're an exception. So
it hasn't been your experience at VTS where these sort of policies concerning people's sexuality and gender identity are in place, that exceptions are, there's always exception. How would you think the enforcement of seminary policy has been with LGBTQ people?
As far as my experience, and I really don't know everything that transpires, but it seems to have been pretty much equilateral, especially around relationships, but I don't know. That's starting to change. I mean, not about the seminary, but even in terms of definitions of family and, who's married to whom, and, I mean, an ever-growing circle of people that I know, not related to the seminary, who are in poly relationships, and that could cause all sorts of issues when you're talking about clergy and churches, and and there's also been sort of the seminary, there's seminary trying to walk a fine line, because some of the, especially some of the international dioceses, where our international students come from, can be an issue. In the sense of what's our standing in the, because general, I mean, too much general stuff going on these days. VTS has always prided itself as being part of, at least in the last 20 years, is very much being sort of a leading force, for lack of a better term, in the Anglican community. Very proud of the fact that many of the bishops across the communion are alums, either an NA after they were ordained, or there was a while where VTS sort of had a reputation for being a finishing school for for foreign bishops.
Yeah.
So there's always been that. How do we walk that? And how do we walk that fine line with alums? Because our alums, got different generations, different ideologies, different church polity, so how do you handle that? I'm sure there are people that were really annoyed when the seminary allowed us how gay students could come here, queer students could come here openly. So,
well, there were annoyed people that were on the faculty at the time.
yes.
So with this idea of seminary's policy and stuff, in your own life, did you ever come in a place where the seminary's policy on how it deals with LGBT issues or partners or relationships, did they ever affect you personally? Especially, I'm thinking like with you living on campus and stuff.
Not really. For a period of time, a couple of times, periods of time, but one longer time I was dating. And it's like I didn't make a big deal out of it. People met Dennis, and there were times when Dennis would come and stay overnight in my apartment. So, but he wasn't living there, so that wasn't I suppose that wasn't an issue.
Was he, with the people that, when you were dating and stuff, were they sort of just like welcome as part of the BTS community when they were here, or?
So on the one hand, when I was dating Dennis, he sort of didn't get the whole church thing necessarily, and so he did not because if he was with in my social group, when we got to talking about church stuff, he would sort of glaze over. But the issue that was a bigger issue was that he's Black, and he will say he's Black. He won't say he's African American, and so there have been times, because he wasn't necessarily a known person on campus, like a known seminarian or staff member or faculty member. So who's this person on campus? And if I was with him, that sort of alleviated that. But if I wasn't, people would question why he was there.
So when it came to your partner's race was more a factor than even their sexuality. Yep. I'm going to shift gears a little bit away from sort of this policy discussion and how it affects. In your time here, who are there people that you think stand out as leaders, both amongst, the seminary as far as agents of change, but also amongst the students when it comes to the queer community? Have people sort of that stand out in your mind as sort of taking on the mantle, as it were?
Well, Ruth Anna somewhat reluctantly, and that she was here long before I was. So, I mean, that was so queer students kind of look up to her as sort of this, and she, I'm pretty sure, would very much like to not have that limelight. She's my experience with Ruth Anna is she's very unassuming and kind of just, this is my life. Can we please get on with what the real important stuff is? I think Lisa to some extent, I mean, but she also, she just pulls people in anyway. I mean, and it's a big advocate for pretty much anybody that if she feels you're worthy of that attention. Socially, to some extent, Bill Roberts was a lot of the prison gatherings were at his home.
So he would host the
Yep, the fall dinner would almost always be at his place, and sometimes spring as well.
What were those meetings like?
Well, the ones at Bill's house were usually much more social. There was a dinner. There was also one that was open to partners and allies. And we would, after dinner, we'd sit and kind of talk about, okay, what is it we want to do this year? Are there any pressing issues that we need to talk about? Kind of looming on the horizon that we need to deal with.
So you talk about Prism and the dinners at Bill's house. Did Prism like have certain traditions that were practiced, or was it different every year? Or
well, there was usually a coming out day event, and when I first got here, it was sort of they either have one or two people like a panel discussion about what their experience was like, and then the year before, well, it was while we were dealing with the tent, because they were doing a refectory, and
So that would have been 20,
Addison,
that would have been 2019.
probably 2019. So the Flamingo was in the wilderness. And so they did their coming out event there in the evening and sort of did an open mic kind of thing. And people just got up and shared their stories. I think we did that once more.
In fall of 2021.
Couldn't have done it in 2020 because we were shut down. And we were in the new, back into Addison, so we were in the new Flamingo space.
Did you ever find that there were like traditions that were VTS traditions that hindered or ignored LGBT community? Or would like make you roll your eyes? Actually,
There's a lot of things around this place that make me roll my eyes, but specifically around queer community. No more than any other thing would make me roll my eyes.
in your time here, have, what are like the pivotal points? Either positive or negative in regards to the LGBT community.
I think definitely building the family housing on campus was a pivotal point, and that was and that was. So that was fall of 20, that was also an issue, but so that was, sort of between the court ruling and the general convention, and that was sort of when they started saying you need to be married unless you're from one of the problem dioceses.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that that was particularly public, but it was known. So that was a big turning point, I think, also because it meant that there were queer families on campus. And so you weren't just seeing mostly just the queer seminarians, the queer staff without spouses or kids or. So I know we had. Yeah, there were at least one couple with children.
And you think that seeing those queer families, which are really just families,
Right, but I mean,
but
because it brings that sense of, I hate to use the word, but normalcy to them, so that it's not outside the seminarian's experience anymore, that they can't say they don't have families.
and you think it did it start changing the tone of the conversations?
So like, there's less conversation.
Okay, less conversation, which in itself is
Right, is
Okay.
changing the tone.
so. While we're talking about the housing, you have this sort of unique position in that you had an apartment in guest housing. You ate in the refectory, the 3 meals with the students. But of course, the 3 meals are the students in the residential housing, not in the apartments.
Right.
So you have this unique perspective of worlds that you get to see. And I've often heard students talk about, whether or not there's a divide between the classes but what they'll say is the big divide now is between the apartment students and the residential hall students. Have you found that to be the case?
So I don't think it's any worse than it was when families were living off campus and off campus apartments. I think they may just be more aware of it because they see the family housing, because we have kids on campus almost all the time, running around and biking and playing games. And they do, spouses and families do show up for like Friday full stops and things like that. So they are, like, on the one hand, yes, there is somewhat that divide, but I think they're also much more integrated into the community than most people's perception.
So in your assessment, someone couldn't say, oh, well, a queer family in housing isn't going to have the same effect as a queer single student, because in your mind, they're actually more integrated than what people actually give credit for.
Right. I mean, they're here, they're part of the community. You know, we see their spouses, we see their kids, of anybody that's in the family housing.
Now, when they were building the apartments, it's interesting when you look at the names of the apartments, because it's so many trees.
Yeah, well, they were all trees at one time.
And then they built the Polly Murray building.
They weren't built, they were named after. They all had tree names when they were first built.
So they renamed one after.
So some, you could give enough money and name it. That's the other one that's named is named after the mother of one. But yes.
And I recognize also, due to your position, you may not be able to give some details, but the naming of one of the apartments after Polly Murray, was that given, in your estimation, was that given more, it's so hard to narrow down her contributions to everything. Was it given in just general, her contribution to everything, or was it more towards her status as, the feminist icon, the civil rights icon, the queer icon?
I think it was in more of the feminist Black icon rather than the queer icon. That's my impression, because I don't remember who gave the money, and even though I could go look it up, that's not something I should be doing.
What was?
I mean, I could. It's common knowledge. I mean, go look at the plaque; it probably tells you who gave the money. But
right. And what was it like? As far as on campus, the renaming of that building, was there any type of excitement of the acknowledgement, or was it like, we don't care what plaque is on the building? Or
yeah, it was kind of, it was part of, there's been a growing away. I mean, Paul Murray's always sort of been part of the fabric of the church, just because everybody wants to claim her and look at this and blah, blah, blah. But I think there's been a growing awareness of her contributions. That she was part of the group that coached Ruth Bader Ginsburg when she took the sex case to the Supreme Court.
yeah, the Ruth Bader Ginsburg talks about how on some of the briefs, that Ruth Bader Ginsburg wrote, she put Polly Murray's name because she couldn't have wrote the briefs without the writings of Polly Murray.
And so I don't think anybody was, I think people were pleased. I don't think there was any kind of, oh, hey, look at this. But just because there's been this growing awareness of Polly Murray and her contributions to the church and society in general. I mean, and actually her queerness was something that wasn't generally known for a very long time. It was kept very quiet.
So as we go into sort of heading towards the end of our time together, you you know, have actually seen, in my estimation, we've seen significant developments that have gone on at VTS from we'll only accept you if you're a single student to now we have housing, to where we now have queer parents raising their children in the and you've been witness to all that and part of the community in all of that. What future do you imagine for the LGBT community when it comes to VTS? And that can be your ideal, and it can be both your ideal and what you think the practical is going to be the case.
What I hope to see is that the community as a whole becomes more aware of us in their midst, and as a vital part of the community. My fear is that given the growing backlash, we may have people some places having to sort of go back into the closet, and then we'll be back to how do we handle that here on campus? And is that going to mean, backing away from some of the stuff that we've done?
Well, it's the irony is not lost on me that VTS was known as the conservative evangelical seminary. For many years, if you were openly queer and going to seminary in the Episcopal tradition, you went to general.
Pretty much.
And now we're in affiliates with each other.
Right.
And VTS is now sort of known as trying to do more of this diversity and inclusion, particularly when it comes to race. But
it's not that we weren't here before that.
Right.
So, Virginia was always, like you said, evangelical, snake belly low, the running joke about the last day of your liturgy class, the professor would take you to a locked closet, open it up, go, those are vestments, and then lock the closet back up. But some of the most liberal clergy that we had in the Diocese of Connecticut, along with some of the queer clergy, were alums at VTS. And so it's not like they haven't been here, but we haven't been here already. It's just more awareness.
With you mentioning that the snake belly low at VTS, because I hear it on campus, the shift in sort of liturgical tradition and emphasis at VTS has shifted from snake belly low to at least broad.
Broad is good.
But oftentimes you hear on campus is, well, they had to shift because of all of the gay Anglo-Catholics. Do you think that that's actually has any merit to it, or?
I don't think so. I know there was an ill-advised article that a now alum and the dean co-wrote about queers and Anglo-Catholicism, and it was not, to my mind, a well done or given enough depth of research article. I don't know what they were trying to prove. I can sort of think what the alum was thinking, but he was at a broad church parish and not a high church parish, so but it's not been necessarily just it hasn't been the high church gay men that in fact it was in my class. Things and a lot of people were really pushing for much more high church stuff, and it wasn't just queer students, it was across the whole. And it's very interesting to watch things shift as different classes come in, and people, well, we don't do this at my parish. It's like, people, You're not going back to your parish. You may not be going back to a high church parish or a low church. You could end up someplace you totally don't expect. So you need to figure this out.
So that is interesting. So sort of what you describe, and we all have heard the sort of the stereotypical joke about the high Anglo gays, and the jokes that are made. But correct me if I'm wrong, from what I'm hearing from your experience, the queer community is not necessarily part of that shift. Well, they're in it, but they're not the cause of the shift.
No, not the, no, I mean, it runs across the student body, in my experience. I mean, I know some very high church straight people that have come through here and really pushed kind of doing, the sung compliment we did for a while before the pandemic, Sunday evenings, which is now, I don't know whether they're singing it anymore online, but that's compliment service continues, but it's now only online. But that was organized by, I mean, sung compliment is pretty high church. And it was participatory, so it's not like you were doing even song when you get sung at. Was organized by the people that were doing it were straight men, well, straight women, but sort of the driving force was a couple of straight men that wanted to do this compliment.
When you were talking about the future that you hope, you said, that will be seen. Could you elaborate? What do you mean by that? Because some would say, oh, the fact that the entering class, the entering class in 2001, all single men except for 2 were identified as gay. Well, that
would not have happened in 2001, I don't think.
It certainly wouldn't have happened, but some would say that is being seen. But at the same time, here we sit, and PRISM is not very active.
Right.
So what is it that you are hoping is being seen? What contribution, what things from the LGBTQ community are you hoping is being acknowledged and seen and contributed by?
So I think, things have often evolved very strangely. I was a member of, was very active for a very long time in the Connecticut Coalition for Lesbian and Gay Civil Rights. And once we got the civil rights legislation passed in the early 90s, it's like, okay, now what do we do? And the coalition literally split over the issue of marriage, because there was a very significant, and this was before, sort of just on the cusp of marriage becoming a really big driving force in the queer community. And so there was a faction of people that were like, no, this is going to be the next thing, marriage, blah, blah, blah. And then there was a faction of people who were very definitely like, we don't want to be part of that heterosexual patriarchal norm. There are other things that are more important. But of course, marriage came in and it took over and it was sort of the driving force for a lot of groups. And I don't think a lot of people expected that. And so what I see now, though, is sort of that expanding of definitions of families, expanding different definitions of gender and identity. Even some of those things that I might not personally be comfortable with. I still think there are things that need to be talked about and things we need to be aware of and things that we need to be more inclusive of, because that's where things are headed. I realize the church is always, a generation and a half or more behind, but I think it's part of sort of our changing society.
Mhm.
And I'm hoping we don't backslide with all of this conservative nonsense that's been of late.
Uh, So as part of that future that you envision, um, do you view that as a mission of the LGBTQ plus community itself? You wanting to see like that more as an active voice, or just the seminary in general?
Well, if it's, well, so see, and I don't know how much, I don't remember seminarians, at least on campus, being active and vocal about marriage issues. I know some of them worked in the home diocese, or may have worked with behind the scenes here or worked with their parishes, but I don't remember seeing very much said or done on campus. So I think some of that was very much individuals and their family situations that drove some of that conversation, which may be the way it goes. But sometimes it's just a matter of being present and being here.
What advice would you give to young or discerning, because we say young, discernment can happen at any age,
True, but
Um,
younger people coming in.
or new, let's go with new.
Okay,
Queer people who are discerning whether or not to attend BTS in future, what advice would you give them?
be who you are. Know that there are people here, currently here, that have trod this path and can, listen and give you some assistance. But also remember that there are a lot of people who have gone before. Some of whom are here, some of whom are not, but that have made it possible for you to be here as an open person. To remember that, and you need to pass that along.
Is there anything else you would like to share?
Can't think of anything at the moment.
Thank you very much, Jeff.
Thank you.